Hi, second grade students. Today we're beginning our new topic in listening and learning. This domain will introduce us to an important period in the history of the United States, also known as westward expansion during the 1800s. You'll learn why pioneers were willing and eager to endure hardships to move westward. You'll also learn about the important innovations of both transportation and communication during this period. Another thing we'll learn is we'll come to understand the hardships and tragedies that Native Americans endured because of westward expansion. Today's story is from Knowledge 7, Lesson 1, called Going West. But before I begin our story, I'm going to go over our vocabulary words. Our first vocabulary word for today's story is the word sympathy. Repeat after me. Sympathy. Sympathy means a feeling of sadness about someone else's trouble or problems. Our next vocabulary word is the word settled. Say settled. Settled means created a permanent home, colony, or community in a new area. Our last vocabulary word is the word sights. Say sights. Sights are things or places seen or worth seeing. You could have been going west in the 1800s. In those days, there were no cars. You would have traveled in a covered wagon like the one shown here. Your wagon would have been pulled by horses, mules, or oxen. You and your family would have bumped along unpaved, dusty roads. You would have traveled all day long, and it would have taken you about 6 months to get from east to west. Does that sound like fun? Actually, your trip might have been even harder. Your family would have had to pack everything you owned into a wagon, including personal belongings, clothing, food, water, and supplies. So there wouldn't have even been room for you to ride in the wagon. That's right, you might have to walk the entire way to Oregon. In the 1840s and 1850s, tens of thousands of Americans went west in wagon trains. These pioneers hoped to make a better life for themselves. Many of them were eager to claim farmland in Oregon or California. They left many of their friends and families behind, loaded everything they had into a wagon, and they set off for the west. So as you can notice, a wagon train is not actually a train. A wagon train is a series of wagons that followed one another on their journey westward. The following story tells about what it was like to make a trip to the West. Unlike some ancient civilizations that we learned about, in which we got most of our information from archaeologists, this account is based on records that people left behind, such as diaries and journals. In this account, the Morgan family makes a trip from Indiana to Oregon. The Morgans were farmers. They hoped to start a new life in Oregon. This is their story. The Morgans left for Oregon in April of 1846. They had a single wagon, loaded with all of their belongings. Mrs. Morgan and the young children rode inside the wagon. The older children walked alongside. They also helped herd the cows that trailed along behind the wagon. The day of their journey, the Morgans traveled 14 miles. When the sun began to set, they set up camp. The boys gathered wood for a campfire. Then Mrs. Morgan cooked supper. After supper, Mrs. Morgan set up beds for the children in the wagon. Once the children were asleep, she lit a candle and wrote the first entry in a journal she had decided to keep. April 11th, 1846. Began our journey to Oregon, made 14 miles on our first day. The sun felt warm upon our skin as we made our way along. Our journey was brightened by the wildflowers that dotted the landscape. By the time we made camp, the older children were exhausted from walking. I have to admit that I gave them each a little extra soup for supper tonight. For the next few weeks, the Morgans traveled west across Indiana and Illinois. They rose early each morning and traveled just before sundown. On their good days, they covered 20 miles. When it rained or the roads were bad, they covered fewer. About 1 month after starting their journey, the Morgans reached the Mississippi River. They hired a ferry to carry them, their wagon, and their animals across the river, as you can see here. On that day, Mrs. Morgan had a lot to write in her journal. This is some of what she wrote. May 10th, 1846. The great Mississippi is wider than I could have ever imagined. Our wagon, our horses, and our supplies were loaded onto a flatboat and carried across the mighty Mississippi. I held my breath as I watched all of our earthly possessions float away. Another month later, the Morgans reached St. Joseph, Missouri, where they bought food and supplies. The next morning, they crossed the Missouri River. This meant that they were leaving the United States and were entering the area people called Indian Territory. On this day, Mrs. Morgan wrote in her journal, June 5th, 1846. The children are hoping to see Indians. We have been told that the Cheyenne and the Pawnee live in the area we are traveling through. We have heard that they are sometimes willing to trade horses and food for clothes and tobacco. A few days later, the Morgans turned onto the main road to Oregon, known as the Oregon Trail. There were many settlers traveling on this road. The Morgans joined up with a group of more than 100 settlers traveling to Oregon. By mid-June, the wagon train was crossing the Great Plains. On all sides, they saw vast open fields of grass without a tree in sight. So this map here shows the Oregon Trail. It was a 2,000-mile-long wagon trail that ran from Missouri all the way to the Pacific Ocean. The Morgans also began to see large herds of buffalo. They noticed that these magnificent creatures spent much of their time with their heads bowed, grazing on the abundant grass. One moonlit June night, as the stars sparkled in the sky, Mr. Morgan shot a buffalo, and Mrs. Morgan cooked the meat for supper. On that night, Mrs. Morgan wrote in her journal, June 14th, 1846, buffalo meat. Although tasty, takes a lot of chewing. I watched the children eat as the flames from the flickering fire lit their dirty faces. The good thing was that they were still chewing and they weren't complaining. A few days later, the Morgans' wagon broke down. Mrs. Morgan stood guard all night in the rain while Mr. Morgan had to fix their wagon. 2 weeks later, something worse even happened. 8 of the oxen that pulled the Morgans' wagon vanished during the night. The Morgans searched and searched for the animals, but they could not find them. They hitched up some of their cows instead. But these animals were not used to pulling a wagon, and the Morgans made very slow progress until they could get better animals. In mid-July, the Morgans reached Chimney Rock, in what is now known as Nebraska. You can see Chimney Rock in this photograph. While admiring the sights or things that you can see, Mrs. Morgan and a friend almost got caught in a hailstorm. This is what Mrs. Morgan had to say about this adventure this evening in her journal. July 15th, 1846. We are making much slower progress. Yesterday, we only covered 11 miles. We were delighted to see Chimney Rock, though we had the most dreadful hailstorm. Mrs. Peterson and I were pelted by hailstones the size of small rocks. The hailstones were torn some of the wagon covers off and broke some boughs, and scared several of our oxen away. A few days later, the wagon train reached Fort Laramie, another common landmark on the trip for pioneers heading west. 2 weeks later, they crossed the Rocky Mountains. Mrs. Morgan wrote, August 9th, 1846. We wound our way over the mountains along a very crooked road. Had rain and hail today, which made it very disagreeable. However, Papa and I smiled as not to discourage the children. In late August, the Morgans traveled across a dry, dusty desert. Mrs. Morgan wrote that the dustiness was nothing like her friends in the East had ever seen. August 30th, 1846. My friends back east know nothing about dust. This dust makes it impossible for us to see where we are going. We cannot even see the oxen that pull our wagon. The cattle struggle to breathe, and we have to taste of the dusty air in our mouths all the time. When the children go to sleep, every one of them is covered in a layer of dust. In mid-September, the Morgans encountered some Native Americans on their journey. Mrs. Morgan wrote, September 14th, 1846. We saw Native Americans along Snake River. They have few horses and no blankets. The immigrants are happy to trade them old clothes for fish. Toward the end of September, a young woman in the Morgan party decided she'd have enough of the Oregon Trail. She sat down on the side of the trail and claimed that she could no longer travel anymore or go any farther. Then she began to sob loudly. The Morgans felt sympathy for her, but there was nothing else they could do but continue to press on. In mid-November, the Morgans reached Fort Dalles, Oregon, on the banks of the Columbia River. They built a raft that would carry them and their things down to the river. Unfortunately, it had been raining for several days. The river was flooded and running too fast for the raft to be able to travel. The Morgans had to wait for several days by the riverside. It was cold, rainy, and windy. The family huddled around a campfire to try to stay warm. Mrs. Morgan recorded 2 entries while they waited for the weather to improve. November 14th, 1846. We are unable to move forward. We must wait for the wind to ease. We have one day provisions left. The warm sunshine has abandoned us, and we are chilled to the bone. November 16th, 1846. No let up in the weather. If anything, it's gotten worse. Waves rise up over our simple raft. It's so very cold that icicles are hanging down from the wagon. On all sides, we see vast open fields of grass without a single tree in sight. Finally, the Morgans were able to make their way down to the river into the Willamette Valley of Oregon. This painting shows what an Oregon town looked like at that time. Unfortunately, during the end of the trip, Mr. Morgan had fallen very ill. Mrs. Morgan rented a tiny house in Portland, and with the help of some kind men, the Morgans moved into a tiny house for the winter. Mrs. Morgan sold their last of their possessions to buy food. Mr. Morgan was so sick he could not get out of bed, and many of the children got sick as well. Mrs. Morgan was so busy caring for her family that she stopped writing in her journal for a while. In mid-February, however, she started writing again. February 13th, 1847. It rains constantly. Our house is cold and the roof leaks badly. It is difficult to keep our spirits up. We are only able to eat one good meal a day. We still dream of our new home in Oregon. I know we will eventually get there. Mr. Morgan recovered, and in the spring, the Morgan family settled on a farm in Oregon. The Morgan family's journey ended well, though for many others who traveled west it did not. So the next time you're on a long trip thinking how boring and terrible it is, think of the Morgans and their trip to Oregon, and remember, it could be much worse.